everybody. Welcome back to another episode. I am really happy today because today we have an amazing educator. His name is David Curran. Hi, David.
Hello, Andy. Hello, folks. Yeah, my name's David Curran. I'm currently teaching at Moon Hall School, Reigate, just outside London in England. We're a dyslexic specialist school. So I've spent just over 20 years in education, a majority of that in state education. I started off as a design technology teacher with 34 students in my workshop. I'd started doing a bit of STEM work, so got into IT, a bit of careers work, and sort of ended up, so this is my 5th year. My current roles are assistive technology lead and also head of careers. I also still do design technology, which kind of fell out of the back end of COVID. So obviously when we went online, we did a lot of sort of AI sort of features in order to be able to deliver our lessons. And our head teacher, our executive head, is also chair of the board of governors for the British Dyslexic Association. So this is my 5th year here. She decided to take assistive technology out of the IT lessons. So things like text to speech, speech to text, mind mapping, touch typing. Our students have now got 1 hour a week on timetable for assistive technology. So we sort of develop those skills earlier on, and then we sort of use those skills in real life situations. So for example, our year 11s, they're currently doing their applications for colleges and using the assistive tech and their AI skills in order to be able to support their learning.
Well, thank you so much for that intro, especially because it gives us a broad understanding on all the things that you have done and what you're currently working on. Now, let's go right to the point. In this particular case, when we're talking about AI and the schools that we're working in, what challenges or goals let you explore artificial intelligence?
Right. Putting it simply, assistive technology, like I say, was put onto timetable in order to give our students better access to their learning and also life skills, soft skills, whatever we want to call them. So my first remit was to make it so it's kind of our students are using their technology in order to be able to assist their learning. We had to come up with like a whole school plan. It was very bitty. So some students were using, some students weren't using. Some of our teachers were aware of what they could use and what they couldn't use. My initial remit was AI sort of its earliest form. So text to speech, speech to text. So we made sure that we got that in place for the students. The students then can kind of use that when ChatGPT, so November 22 landed and generative AI was brought in. It was a natural progression for our students to then use generative AI within their learning and also for us as staff to start using it as well. The system was in place. We're very fortunate. All our students have got devices, for example. We have this 1 hour a week on lesson time, right back, like say, 22, the start of 23. Our year 9 students, so 13 and above, we got consent from parents and they just jumped, feet in, same as we did with using ChatGPT. We've kind of backtracked since then, obviously with a lot of legislation and making sure we've got sort of a whole school digital plan now. But yeah, sort of feet first rather than head first, I would say.
How does it look like to have in your classroom artificial intelligence? Can you give us a very specific case scenario, especially during the early days and how that actually evolved?
Yeah. So, for example, the assistive technology, that text to speech and speech to text, when our students started using ChatGPT, was it 3.5? Yeah. There wasn't that kind of interactivity that we're able to use now, that sort of being able to converse with ChatGPT. So it was a case of we dabbled in what it was, and I think we kind of used it like a lot of people are still using it now as like an extended Google or Bing, where you just kind of just doing a search. So it meant that students could sort of click in and use their headsets and dictate instructions in, and then also listen to information that came back out. So that was kind of the first case scenarios. I started to give them little prompts, for example. So I would set it up as a writing helper, for example, and it would help them structure an essay or an assignment. So as they did their work, they could ask it questions and kind of backwards and forwards. So yeah, kind of it started off like a Google or a Bing doing research and then helping support the thinking process.
Now, Of course, that putting all that in practice is not as simple as it sounds because, of course, you make it sound like, oh, yes, of course, we're all so used to it. We just implemented it, right? So, who was involved in making it happen? How was the process from thinking about implementing it to actually implementing it in the school? I know that there was like sort of like a natural flow in your institution, but it would be really interesting to understand which were the steps that you took.
Yeah. I mentioned our executive head, so our head teacher, also sort of from her background as well, is very quickly the advantages, the benefits of using generative AI. So she was very open for staff within the school in order to be able to use it either for themselves or for the students. I'm also a father of two daughters. My youngest daughter is dyslexic, and she was struggling with maths at the time. So since then, I've heard sort of several educators kind of come at it from a personal point of view. It starts to take away when you're helping outside school, it takes away that sort of daddy time, that one-to-one time, daddy time, and you become kind of a teacher, daddy teacher, rather than a sort of a father. So I was looking at ways of kind of supporting her within her education that maybe we could come up with something that we could do something together rather than it being that kind of teacher student kind of relationship. So yeah, that was one of my first ins, was looking at how to support her maths originally. And by doing that, I was then able to sort of take that into the classroom, and I could get students to actually trial things out as well. So strangely enough, it brought that the kind of the idea behind it started from with my daughter. We've kind of moved on and done other things to support her learning, and it's me taking it back into the classroom. I've actually developed more within the classroom with my other students, and then also finding those champions. So find those champions amongst your staff. You know, there was one or two other people that were starting to use it as well, and sort of firing those ideas of, you know, what can you use and how can you use it, and those discussions. And it was those little discussions in the staff room that really sort of sparked, oh yeah, let's try that. Like I say, I'm very fortunate because I've got small, 8, 10, 12 students within my class. They've all got personal devices, or they had access to computers at the time. They've now got personal laptops, but also having that 1 hour a week. My design technology lessons are slightly different because obviously you've got to stick to curriculum. With the assistive technology, I've not got a curriculum to follow. So it just gave me that freedom to explore and play around. And, you know, from that, we developed like writing helpers. Our year 10s and 11s used them as study buddies in order to help them to do revision. We started to look at sort of how we use it for career support as well. So I'm very, very fortunate that I had the time on the timetable in order to play around with the technology. And I use that word, you know, that word play. There's very little of the word play off. Often I find in education, we're quite regimented and we're quite strict. But it gave me that opportunity to play, and also for the students to do the same. We went on the journey together.
It is not only interesting, but really makes me smile from ear to ear because I love the way that you're saying that you took the steps together, meaning that from the moment that you started implementing artificial intelligence, the students were on board, and I imagine that the parents were on board too, which are one of the most difficult ones sometimes to get on board. But I believe that in specific institutions, artificial intelligence is a lot more welcome rather than the ones that are a little bit more classic because
Yeah.
we're always open to try new things. If it's going to work, why not, right? We don't know if it's going to work until we try it out. How did you decide which tools were appropriate and which were the ones that you definitely discarded and why?
We jumped in feet first, and then we kind of backtracked. So it was a case of let's try it, let's see what works, let's see what our students can use, let's see what I can use as a teacher. So for the first year or so, I still worked on a free ChatGPT account purely so I could go through the same frustrations as my students, or limitations as my students. We soon found out, for example, just things like safeguarding. I mean, I know there's a recent sort of court case with OpenAI. There was one last year with character AI as well. That safeguarding feature was really sort of, like I say, we weren't looking at it from a safeguarding as in a legal aspect. It was just a case of students had information on their screens and they were quite simply going, sir, you need to come and see this. Me not being able to access what they were looking at, particularly real time, just set up a lot of red flags for safeguarding as well. So it was a case of, right, okay, this is the issue. Our students were using it. They were coming up with some great and imaginative ways, but how to safeguard it. So we looked at various platforms. I was just very, very fortunate that, at the same time as I was looking at that, I just chanced upon a webinar. I think LinkedIn, there's a guy, John Dolman, who does a lot of stuff around AI. And one of the greatest lines I've heard was, yeah, LinkedIn is the greatest CPD he's ever had. And I will, I will stand by that as well. I was just quite fortunate, right time, right place. And I saw somebody producing chatbots on this particular platform. I looked into it. It worked. It did exactly what I wanted it to be. The safeguarding aspects were there. The students could use it, and I could real time see what they were looking at. It red flagged if any of the students came up with any words that they needed to do. It wasn't feeding information back onto the internet. So information was stored locally, because obviously we have that worry about students putting personal information onto ChatGPT and it being sort of leaking out onto the internet. So yeah, it was a kind of, let's try it, let's see what works. ChatGPT was working, but obviously, bells were ringing with regard to safeguarding intellectual property as well, and that information being fed out onto the internet. So that's why we moved to this particular platform that we use currently.
So how did you basically handle staff training, privacy,
Yep.
ethics, and ensure equity and inclusion from the start?
Yeah. So that was quite a big thing, was bringing the plan together. It was quite sort of little bits of explosions here, and having those conversations on the staff room, in the staff room. One of the big things I say, conversations in the staff room. I talk to teachers nowadays, and some of them are saying, you know, we've not really started our journey, but they're having the conversations. And I think that's really, really important that, that staff have those conversations. Getting parents on board was another big thing. So we started I was already doing sort of assistive technology webinars in the evening for parents. So we introduced an AI, kind of quite literally, AI for generative AI for beginners, for parents, and getting parents on board. Because I think there's quite a lot of, as a parent myself, what am I meant to instruct, and teach and get my children involved in, and what should I expect the schools to do? But I think there's a lot of parents out there who just don't have that digital or that technology know-how. So it was great to sort of have those conversations and talk to parents and find out from students how they were using it, but find out from parents how they felt that their students were using it. It was amazing how many parents didn't think that their kids were using it, and then you're having those conversations in classroom, and the kids are using Snapchat AI and jumping on ChatGPT and not really kind of thinking about they were using it because it was helpful to them, and I kind of think back when I was that age, I wouldn't have thought about safeguarding. I wouldn't have thought about, the legal aspects of it. I'd have just used what was there. We talk about it with regards things like cheating as well. But if you're not told what is cheating and what isn't cheating, humans naturally find that shortcut, that fastest point between A and B. So it's having those conversations with students, it's having those conversations with parents, kind of what should you use it? How should you use it? When should you use it? And creating that safe and ethical environment for people to then to play, to explore, to use that technology.
It's also true that, for example, you and I, when we were growing up, we didn't have, these guardrails because we are not digital natives. We were the transition generation, and for us, it was, you live and learn kind of
Yeah.
experience, right? I honestly believe that it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
Our digital natives are sometimes not even expressing that they're using it because they sort of like have this feeling that my mom and dad are not really going to understand what is
Mm.
A or what is B. So I think that what you're creating, like these sessions with the parents, is one of the takeaways that I'm taking with me from this interview, because it is important to talk to the parents in a way that it's not only about the kids' safety, but to understand what is AI itself. So in this particular case, how is it that the adoption of artificial intelligence has changed the school's mindset in general? And when I'm talking about the school, it's like the entire ecosystem.
You're starting to see these little islands, these little pockets. So we've got traditional teachers who teach in a particular way, and it works and it continues to work. And we've got teachers who are jumping in and using so for example, one of our champions right at the beginning was an English teacher. So when he was talking to his students and they were talking about creative writing, they'd start off with creative writing. He didn't think twice about throwing Mid-Journey on the board behind him and putting in their suggestions for a story. And again, AI to create it. And then from there, they could then use that in order to be able to inspire their own writing. So I then took that into assistive technology and got our students, to start using generative AI in order to be able to use those skills. And it's not necessarily getting generative AI to perform the task. It's getting students to use generative AI to develop their own skills. I read a lot about critical thinking skills, for example, creativity skills, about how we're going to become dependent on generative AI and stop using those skills. I think it's just as important to show how students can enhance those skills by using generative AI. If I've got a student looking at a blank piece of paper and they've got to write a story on the door, and the more they stare at that blank piece of paper, the whiter, the brighter it gets back at them, whether it's a piece of paper or whether it's a screen. But by just getting them, for example, to think, so one task I'll do, for example, I'll get them to think, and they're not allowed to talk. They'll have 2 minutes and they have to think about the door in their head. Then I'll get them either to dictate it or type it onto the screen, and they've got to describe their door. And then they can then feed that into a text to image generator. And then all of a sudden they're like, that's not the door. That's not what I, and then you can break that down and that you will, why is it not your door? Well, my door's not gold. My door is green. Well, did you write that down? Well, no, I didn't. I said, right, well, that's the information here. You've got to communicate that information. You've got a clear picture in your head of what you want to communicate. Now it's communicating that information. So the student will then go back and they'll go back to their prompts and they'll edit their prompt until, so as well as kind of using the generative AI, what we're doing there is developing their communication skills, developing their critical analysis skills, their critical thinking skills. So they're actually developing their skills rather than sort of outsourcing their thinking to a generative AI. Because we also have conversations with students that are going to go, well, what's the point if generative AI is going to do this? Then what's the point in me learning how to do it? Well, you've got to learn how to use that technology that's out there. It's not going to replace you. It's going to, it needs to enhance what you already are or what you do.
Listening to what you're saying right now, like, is that the picture that you had in your mind and they getting angry or frustrated because it was not at all what they had in mind? It actually brings back a lot of previous experiences that we had, that my team and I had during this year. In this particular case, it was with the teachers. They just got in there and they asked things like, make me a lesson plan for introduce your subject, right? But there was no input, there was no specifics, there was nothing there, right? So even if when you say that we humans have a tendency for shortcuts, that's why we have technology in the first place.
Yeah.
One of the things that keep on repeating and coming to my head is like, okay, so what are the things that changed the most when it comes to the teaching styles and learning styles within your staff when using AI?
Yeah. So like I say, we developed these chatbots for the students to use. So we've got subjects revision helper bots. We've got careers bot as well. Was nominated for an award last year, which was really exciting. We've also got SEN therapy bots to help with kind of the admin side, and then we've also got this teacher resource creation bot. So I'm using UDL, Universal Design for Learning, cognitive load. For those teachers who want shortcut, it's very, very easy to go to a shiny wrapper and just put it in and for it to produce a lesson plan. What we don't want are these bland lesson plans that aren't specifically tailored towards our students. So for those teachers who are interested, we ran sort of whole school CPD, but we've also run sort of lunchtime CPDs for those that want to get sort of into the nitty gritty and write their own chatbots, or just to help them better prompts for neurodivergent students. I say all our students are dyslexic. So how do we create accessibility features for our students to learn within our resources? So we've got teachers who are creating their own chatbots. So I created a chatbot based on those principles. So teachers can then sort of ask those questions. So instead of going to ChatGPT and creating just kind of a bland, kind of a standard lesson plan, we've got training data attached to it. So we've got Rosenshine's principles attached to it. We've got British Dyslexia Association, National Autistic Society training data attached to our chatbots. So the output that comes from our chatbots is being guided. So rather than it using sort of the information that's being scraped from the internet that sits in, ChatGPT's training data, we've actually got specific training data that we can tailor, that we can use. We use that with our teacher resource creation bot. Like I say, we also use that for our subject bots, our student facing chat bots. So it should be more sort of dyslexia empathetic. There should be that empathy in there. It should sort of bullet point. It should read the way that the student interacts with it and then vary its reading age, for example. So those things were kind of built into the student facing bots at the same time as creating this teacher facing bot in order to be able to create resources. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, it does. It does, especially because, again, we're talking about a very different type of school, which is very important. Sometimes we forget that artificial intelligence comes to help and enhance everybody, or at least that is the point for us educators to take the technology that is out there in this moment. It is Gen AI specifically, and transform it in a way that is beneficial for us and our students, right? How is it that you are measuring impact? What indicators matters most in your school right now?
It's engagement, isn't it? I think what I think right from the very start, generative AI was only, or I could personally only ever considered it to be another tool in my toolkit. So it's measuring the engagement. So I don't need to do lots and lots of studies to find out that I can produce different resources for the same objective or the same end goal. So, for example, I've just done I'm in design technology. We've done an end of unit test, and then you get that, you stand there and you hand all the tests back, and then there's the initial furore of like what grades and what results they've got, and then you've got to go through it, and you've got to go through it with students. So you start off question one, half the students have got it right, half the students haven't. So from the board, I've then got to sort of go through the correct answer. Well, those students that have got it correct, they immediately disengage. They're not interested. They're moving on. They're then having conversations. Well, I got it right this first time. Now I can engage them by saying, well, let's not media the teacher. Let's bring all the students in. How did they get this correct? That's a different style of teaching. But what I can do now is, for example, I can have a chat bot that then goes through the results with them. So they can then go through their test. They've got the test re-put onto it. They've got a chat bot that then helps them. So they can go through the answers they've got correct. They can then look at the answers that they've not got correct. They can ask the little chat bot for support. So we won't give them the answer. It's like more Socratic mode, but it will kind of discuss the area or the topic around with them. They can have that one-to-one conversation with the chat with the headset on. So everybody's learning, but everybody's learning at different paces, at different styles. So some students are doing question one, some students have already done that. If, for example, question 6 is quite weak, I might put a little video in there so they can now listen to the video at the same time. And then it also gives me that opportunity to go and help that child that wants that one-to-one support. So generative AI has now given me more ins. So I've created a resource, I've created a support for that resource. I've created multiple aspects. So some students want to read it on paper. Some I've rehashed it and I've put it as a digital so they can then use the text to speech to text. Some are using the chat bot. Some are talking to each other. Some are using me. It just means that within one lesson, I've got more engagement within that lesson. It's very, very easy for me to then look at, for example, our English helper bot. So I can then track their progress. They can write a creative story. They then use the English helper bot to then improve their story. They've still got the original and then they've got the improvements. So I can see that. Now, I'm not an English teacher. I'm teaching the assistive technology side. It's developing those skills. And then once they've got those skills, they can take those skills into the English. But talking to their English teachers, they're saying what the information that the chatbot's given them is very, very similar to the information that they would give them. We use the school rubrics or the exam board rubrics. So it mirrors, it parallels. So I can't sit here and say, oh, we have 20% greater engagement in class and our students have raised their learning by 1 grade. I've not got that kind of substantial data, but what we do have is you just look in your classroom and all of a sudden more of your students are engaged. They've all got ins. They're all able to do it their way. They can use their support how they want to. And me as a teacher, I can then sort of get in amongst them. I'm very, very much the human in the loop. Generative AI is a tool in the toolbox. It's there to use. Assistive technology, AI, plus the human in the loop is amazing opportunities for all learners. It's not going to be the be all and the end all. It's not the magic wand that,
We don't want to have repetitive conversations. I totally get that. But it is still important in the sense that it's a reminder that this opportunity that artificial intelligence allows us to be more personal and personalize the learning in the classroom makes a whole new difference, because perhaps it might look tiny, but it doesn't look tiny to the student. Now, looking back, what's one thing that you would have liked to do differently than what you right now? Especially this question is not, like there is nothing that we can do right now if it's already been done, right? But for those that perhaps are starting their journey
yeah.
in institutions that are similar to yours or just regular institutions, what is it that you could tell them that you wish you would have done differently?
What I would say is it's the boring bit, but get your foundations right. Make sure you've got your AI policy in place. Make sure you've got your documentation in place. Make sure that you're coming from safe foundations. Like I say, we kind of jumped in and we kind of learned. And I think because we were quite early adopters, I think we kind of learned along with a lot of other educators and a lot of other schools. When we were trialing it out, we kind of made mistakes. So we were able to then sort of go back and correct those mistakes. For example, confirmation from parents for 13 and above to use ChatGPT. At the start of each year, we send out a letter or an email and we make sure we've got written consent, and it's only those little bits, but it just means that as a parent myself, I see something and the school goes, oh, we're doing this. And you go, oh, yeah, that's fair enough. And I don't really read the in-depth thing. But by making a parent sign that document, I can also explain this is how we're going to use it. So it means that the parent now engages with it as well. So yeah, make sure your policies are in place, make sure your documentation's in place, make sure that you're coming from a safe environment, make sure you're coming from an ethical environment. Those conversations, we were quite lucky. We had sort of sporadic conversations, but yeah, whole school CPD, get everybody talking about it. When your school, and again, I kind of go back to my daughter's in a state school, so generative AI is very, very low on their list of priorities. They've got attendance and they've got behavior and they've got performance. It's quite low, but I think it's really, really important to kind of tie all those things in together. You know, Generative AI or use of Gen I or use of assistive technology can affect, you know, can affect behavior. If students can't find an into education, then they're going to misbehave. So generative AI, it's not the answer, but it's an answer. So it might be something that you want to look at as a whole school, as a way of tackling behavior. If students aren't attending school because they're not interested in school, then as educators, what do we do to put the interest back into education? And if generative AI is another in that students will use, I've got a great story. I created this little careers chatbot and had that conversation at the start of year 11 with our students. What do you want to do when you leave Moon Hall? And immediately you get these kind of what I thought were silly comments, typical atypical teenage boy comments. Then for about half an hour, one student in particular, I lost him, completely lost him, totally absorbed. And I was looking in at his conversation thinking, no, he must be looking at mountain biking here. And he wasn't. For half an hour, he just was conversing with this chatbot. And at the end of it, I asked for some feedback, and he just wrote, "This is the best thing you've ever created, sir," and just walked out the room. And I thought, right, okay, fair enough. He came and found me later that day, and he wanted more information. So he found me in the staff room at lunchtime and wanted more information. And then I looked at his conversation, and his conversation was kind of all over the place. Very what you would say in your head, what a dyslexic student, what dyslexic conversation would be like. I then spoke to his English teacher, and his English teacher said, oh, that'll be his PDA. And as you know, an educator for 20 odd years, what's PDA? Pathological demand avoidance. So for half an hour, he had this chatbot that wasn't judging him, wasn't checking his spelling mistakes, wasn't bothered about the stupid questions. He could ask it whatever he wanted. He wasn't being interrupted by other people. For half an hour, he just had everything that he needed. And it was kind of it was creating that safe environment, that ethical environment where he could express himself, and he could, for half an hour, he had what he needed. And I think it's that creating an environment for our students to learn and also want to learn. And from that, he then came and found me, and he wanted more information as his head of careers. So I think schools need to provide a safe environment, an ethical environment, and an environment where students want to learn. And I think then behavior and attendance, some of those issues might reduce.
You see, you have tackled a very specific point here, which is that they were using it in a safe environment. And unfortunately, some or most of the students are not using it in a safe environment. Because, for example, this tool that you have created, you created it with the very specific guidelines, having this very specific student in mind. And that's why for them it felt perfect. It felt like this is my perfect fit. Except that we know that sometimes when some of our students are using other tools, other large language models that are not designed by an educator, or they're just there designed for different purposes, the result is very different.
Mhm.
Or definitely not safe, to use that word for lack of a better one, right? What is it exactly that you're telling your students, like, okay, these are the things that we're doing within the classroom and in our school, but what happens out there where they get to experience the world, the new AI world, where the teacher is not there, their parents perhaps are not there, they're just alone facing that reality.
Yeah, I think this is just education rather than a generative AI question, to be honest. I think like to think that our teachers model good behavior, good practice, and it's that kind of good behavior and good practice to create good citizens. You know, that it's that environment for students to learn not just subjects, but to learn about themselves and develop themselves as human beings. And I think generative AI is exactly the same. So we use dedicated chatbots lower down the school. It's funny now because our year 10s, year 11s, when they use ChatGPT, it doesn't do what they want it to do because they've seen what how they want an so for example, they put in a question into ChatGPT. ChatGPT, you know, that sort of little puppy dog next to them, very, very helpful, full of enthusiasm, just blasting with a load of text, you know, and they just look at that. They're not even going to start to decipher that, but they look at it and now they're saying, well, that's not what I want. The chatbot that was written before was written that broke it down into a style that was easy for them to then to read. So now they're going, right, okay, do you know what, ChatGPT? This is what I want. So they're now quite happy and confident to say, please break this down, put this in bullet points, create this as a table. You know, what are the keywords to take out of it? Because they've been used to using a chatbot, they've seen what they want and how they like it. Now they're then able to transfer that into generative AI. And I think they're also doing that. Well, I don't think, I know that some are, obviously there are some that aren't, but some are also then taking that as they're challenging information as well. So when they see a piece of information that comes out of ChatGPT, I think generally people accept that as being, well, it's off the internet, it must be true. And those hallucinations, that bias, because we've done little tasks, you know, so we did a little task a few weeks ago where I got the students, and we used ChatGPT for the with the year 11s to use it as a fortune teller. And I just got them to say, I'm from wherever they were, and then they had to say whether they like what gender they were. And then we wrote a little copy and paste prompt, and it asked them to predict where they were going to be in 20 years. And they did it, and they all got quite excited. And I said, right, okay, I want you to change one word. You can either change the gender or you can change the place that you come from. And just by changing the play, and I mirrored it myself. I did it from Salford. I grew up, which is a working class town near Manchester, and I changed it. And I went from, yeah, sort of, I'd go into some sort of apprenticeship scheme, and then I'd be working, you know, and I'd be down the pub with my mates at 50 odd years old. And then I just changed it and I just put Chelsea, very affluent area in London. And it then moved me into working in business and finance. And the students did it as well. And just seeing just that change of one word, I can talk about bias, I can talk about hallucinations as much as I want, but by doing something like that was really, really powerful. And the students are starting to challenge the information of ChatGPT now. And I think that's one of the biggest things. So the way that it's formatted, or even what ChatGPT considers to be facts, students are challenging that now. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that our students will, they're going to use that now for the rest of their lives, because the way that they were introduced to it was in a safe, and back to what we're saying, in that safe and ethical environment. They're challenging it. They're not seeing generative AI as being the answer. They're seeing it as an answer.
And what about for 2026? Is there like, what is basically the plan that we're going to implement? Because we're far off the pilot stage. So, in this particular case, what is it that we're planning for 2026 and the years to come when it comes to artificial intelligence? But so far, let's just focus on 2026 because who knows what's going to happen, right? So, let's focus
Yeah.
on just 2026.
I think it's just the amount of ins, isn't it? It's just, there's so many platforms out there doing some great stuff. So, but you mentioned it at the beginning with staff as well. It's finding that consistency. I think, we brought in a whole school digital plan, and this is my 5th year here. We've been trying for quite a while. What are the minimum expectations? What should we expect our students to be able to do? What should we expect our staff to be able to do? And like I say, we're quite a small school. We're only 200 students from sort of year 3 to year 11. So we've got, 35 students in each year group. We're quite fortunate. And like I say, I have to keep going back to when I was in state schools. Our year groups were bigger than that. So it's just making sure, I think, as a small school, if we can't get that consistency in, how on earth is a large school meant to get that consistency in? We're very fortunate to have one-to-one devices, but how does a state school bring that in, where you've got to book out, where you've got to book out a computer room for one class, and there might be 6 classes in that year group? How do you translate that onto a bigger scheme? So as a school, getting consistency across the whole school, we're playing around with lots of different platforms and kind of what works and what doesn't work. I think it's very, very easy to look for those shiny wrappers. So we're trying to develop. So personally, I'm trying to develop, for example, when we're prompting or creating resources, I've got certain little kind of frame structures that I use. And when I'm working with other schools, also bringing that in. There's a cartoon about it, and I use it a lot, particularly at the moment, whereby the cartoon's drawn, and then the child with the disabled sitting in the wheelchair is kind of in the snow and looking at the caretaker, and just says, when are you going to clear the snow off this ramp? And the caretaker, really, really innocently just says, I'm trying to get the snow off the stairs first, that everyone else can get, so everybody else can get in, because he's thinking about the majority. And the person in the wheelchair says, yeah, but if you clear the snow off the ramp first, everyone can get in. So I'm looking at creating kind of, when we're creating resources, looking at resources that if we can find a way of accessibility for all rather than accessibility for a few, then I think we're onto a bigger thing, rather than looking at, our SEND students and how do we create resources for our SEND students. If we can create resources for our SEND students, then surely all students can learn from that. And there's a word differentiation that I absolutely hate, but I kind of understand why it's there. If we're meant to look at students as being individuals, creating resources, creating ins. You mentioned before about personalized learning. I think there's personalized learning, but there's also customized learning as well, where we customize, where we tailor our resources for our students. And it might be that all students are going towards the same end goal, but they're going towards it in a different way or a different fashion with different support. And I think generative AI, whether it's creating the resources or creating the support within a lesson, I think that gives us options now that we've never had before. So it's finding those different platforms, what works, what doesn't work, and getting that support in. So every student has their own individual, their own personalized, but their own customized educational journey.
Thank you, David, so much for your time. I personally have learned quite a lot about especially becoming a lot more empathic, because when you think that you are developing your empathy, perhaps you're seeing it from the perspective of privilege and not the perspective of, for example, the person that is actually in need of that empathy. So thank you so much for your time. And for those watching and listening to this episode, thank you again. Here we had David Curran, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you.